Hi guys, welcome to another Road Pilgrim car review. Thank you so much for joining me, and today we have the very handsome looking MG4 EV on review. So for those of you who don't know, this car does not have a predecessor. This is an all new model from MG, and some of you might have seen like the MG5 or the MGHS or the ZS around, and this is an all new model called the MG4, and it takes the form of a sort of like a hatchback, but it is a little bit elevated. So we'll take a look at so for today's review, we're going to take a look at the exterior, jump into the interior, and then later on we're going to take you for a drive as well. So let's go. Alright, so this is the exterior of the MG4 EV, and I don't know what you guys think, but I think it's quite a good looking hatchback. It's got this really nice scoopy front, which I think looks really sporty with the angular headlights as well. This car, I'll show you the side profile. Although it's a hatchback, it does feel like it's jacked up a little bit, so it's got like a little bit of crossover feels, which I think is quite nice. And here at the back, probably the highlight of the exterior, you've got this really nicely designed rear end with these tail lamps that sort of stick out, you can see here. And you've also got some roof spoilers as well, which are just a nice little bit of aesthetic finish for the car. Generally, it's a pretty neat looking SUV, and I think it looks very contemporary and very young, pretty youthful. And this car is actually sort of like an entry-level EV if you think about the other cars that are in the same segment. And there aren't too many cars in that segment actually. I would say that this car probably sits in the same segment as maybe like the BYD Atto 3 in terms of price. But of course, this is a hatchback, and the BYD Atto 3 is a SUV. So I guess that all comes down to consumer preference, whether or not you prefer to have a smaller, sleeker package in the MG, or whether you prefer a larger car or a larger SUV like the Atto 3. But generally, I would say this is a pretty good looking car. This particular car comes with 17-inch rims as standard, although I think that it would look a whole lot better if it were to have larger 18-inch or maybe even 19-inch wheels. And the car does have the power to account for that as well. So although this is an entry-level EV, this is actually packing almost 200 horsepower, which also means that it sits in category B COE, and definitely more than enough power to handle larger wheels. Might affect the range a little bit, but I don't think that's going to make too much difference in a city environment like Singapore. So let's jump into the inside and check out the interior of the car. Okay, so now we are seated in the cabin of the MG4 EV, and I think generally the design has been made to feel quite futuristic. And I think the largest telltale sign is probably this steering wheel, which is not a round steering wheel, sort of like a flat bottom steering wheel. It's got a flat top as well. So I think that looks quite young, quite contemporary, quite sporty actually. And there are also not too many dials and buttons cluttering the center console. It's a pretty neat center console. So what you have up front dominating the dashboard is of course the touchscreen infotainment unit. This particular infotainment unit, I would say, has a rather high resolution. So if you put the car into reverse, the reverse cameras are actually pretty good. I would say, I mean, obviously it's not the best in the market, but for an entry-level car, I think the resolution on the reverse camera is actually pretty good. It's pretty nice. And you also have sort of a 360 camera to guide you, which I think is a feature that you don't often find in a car in this particular segment. Dashcam was talking. Yes, you don't often find 360 cameras on a car in this segment, so I think that's a real nice touch. Further down the center console, you have a wireless charging pad here for you to put your phone. It does feel a little bit shallow and exposed. I'm not sure if you chuck your car around the corner whether or not your phone might fly out, but it's nonetheless still a good feature to have. I'm just trying to see if these mats are removable. They don't feel like it, but yeah. Okay, over here you have something of a floating console. It's flat bottom, and underneath you have cup holders. You have some USB ports, and of course you've got your 12-volt socket. But other than that, this particular center console only houses the rotary drive selector and your parking brake, which is really neat, very nice. In the middle, you've got some storage options as well here. You can't really see that further down, but it's quite sizable and you can put quite a large amount of things here. In front of the driver, you've got a square-shaped driver's instrument display, which is full digital, so that's also quite nice. But I also do think that digital driver's displays are kind of a point of parity in today's market, so almost every car you get will probably have a digital driver's display, so I don't think it's a point of differentiation anymore. But nonetheless, it's got a fairly neat display. It shows you what you need. Everything is quite clear, none of it is confusing, and of course you've got multi-function steering wheel here to adjust various menus within the instrument, the driver's instrument display. There is quite a bit of plasticky materials in the car, such as over here, and your buttons can do sound a little bit plasticky, but I would say that it is probably in line with a car of this segment, in a sense where some of its competitors will also have a fairly equal amount of hard plastics in the car. So I think you get what you pay for, and I think there's also not too much fuss to be made about materials like that in a car of this segment. But generally, I think it's got a nice, the MG4 has got quite a nice, modern looking, clean interior that I think will appeal to people who don't like the entire cluttered interior or cabin where there are too many buttons around, because the MG4 is pretty neat, there's not a lot of buttons around, and I think it all feels quite futuristic. So I think that's a job well done, and I am now going to jump to the back and see how it feels. Okay, so sitting at the back of the MG4 EV, this driver's seat is in my regular driving position. I'm 175 meters tall, and we do have a decent amount of legroom in the rear. I would say the legroom isn't awesome, but this isn't a large car, so I think that makes sense. There are some holders here and two little pockets here, which I think are too small to fit a phone, so I'm not entirely sure what is supposed to fit in here. But nonetheless, I'm sure you'll find some use for it, you know, whether you're keeping your headphones inside, or I don't know, maybe some like cosmetics, who knows. Over here in center console, you have a additional USB port. However, you do not have rear aircon vents in this car, so that's probably something that we will miss a little bit in Singapore's weather, because you know Singapore is rather warm and hot, so rear aircon vents are always welcome. But nonetheless, there is quite a nice amount of spaciousness in the rear here, and one of the reasons that it feels quite spacious is also because it has an almost flat floor in the cabin, which means that you can quite easily shuffle between the seats. And the middle seat, although it's a little bit jacked up, the middle passenger will feel quite comfortable because there is enough room, there's enough leg room for them to put their legs in the middle. Yeah. Other than that, the appearance of the cabin is quite nice. You've got some soft touch materials over here. The rest of the door panels are a little bit plasticky, but like I said, totally in line with a car at this price point. And if you're thinking of carrying kids in this car, you've also got ISOFIX points in the car, which are easily accessed through this Velcro strip here that hides the ISOFIX points, so that's good. Yep, so that's the rear of the EV4, and right now we're going to go take the car for a drive and we'll see how that performs on the road. Let's go. Alright guys, so now we are on the roads with the MG4 EV, and the very first thing you realize, and because this car is a rear wheel drive powered car, the handling in the MG4 EV is actually really it's actually quite a nice car when you chuck it around a corner. It's quite typical that with EVs or with entry-level EVs that are front-wheel drive, for example, that when you do put the power down, because EVs tend to be quite powerful as well, what happens is that you do feel the front wheels lose a little bit of it kind of feels lighter and it doesn't feel like so in control. This particular car, however, feels totally different, and I'm really loving the rear wheel drive format of the car. The car handles wonderfully around a bend, which I think if you are looking for, if you are in the market for entry-level EV, but you are still quite conscious about some of the driving dynamics that can be derived from the car, then this MG4 EV could really be something that you might like. So in terms of specs, the MG4 EV packs about 200 horsepower, 201 actually, and this puts out about 250 Newton meters of torque, and you've got about 450 kilometers of range, and that's what's on paper. So in reality, you probably do something closer to 400, which is actually quite similar, quite comparable to the BYD Atto 3, which I mentioned was kind of like in a similar segment in terms of price point. So I think that's true. It's all quite on par. Based on this current setup, this car will do 0 to 100 in about 7.9 seconds, which is decent, and I think it's got quite a nice balance of power in terms of acceleration and range as well. Of course, in Singapore, I don't think if you're using this car in Singapore, you will really need the full 450 kilometers of range, because you'll probably have access to a charger that's quite near to you. I mean, it is a city after all. But of course, having more does give you a little bit more flexibility in terms of when you charge your car, and of course if you're going up to Malaysia, that gives you a little bit less downtime as well. So I think all this ties into a package that's actually quite usable and quite practical in terms of owning an EV. And I think that's also particularly important for EV in this segment, because people who are looking for EVs in the entry segment are probably consumers who perhaps aren't fully sold about the concept of EVs yet, and they probably want to try out a car or try out an EV in the entry segment to see how they feel in terms of its day-to-day usage, before maybe embarking on something a little bit more premium or something a little bit more expensive. So I think the MG4 provides people, or provides consumers, a very good starting point if you are looking to get yourself immersed in EV usage and get used to how an EV feels around town and around how it fits into your life, so on and so forth. So I think that's really cool. So up on the highway, this car, despite being a hatchback, I would say it feels very composed, and this car actually has quite a bit of continental car feels to it, if I'm really being honest. The whole car feels like it's weighted quite nicely, and I don't really get too much jumpiness at the back as well, despite being a hatchback. With hatchbacks, it's quite typical to get a little bit of jumpiness at the back because you don't have too much weight hanging over the rear axle. But in the MG4, I think the front rear balance is actually pretty decent. Nice amount of power here. Ooh, neat. Right. Yeah, it's got quite a good balance, front and back, and of course, like I mentioned earlier, it handles really nicely around a corner as well. So if you are going a little bit faster around a roundabout or a U-turn, the car sticks quite nicely. It's very little body roll, very decent. Pretty pleased with this car and how it drives. And I think the way the MG4 drives is probably the highlight of the car, because I'll admit, when I first got into the car, I was a tiny bit skeptical about the interior in terms of the material use.
Build quality is okay, nothing wrong with the build quality, just that perhaps the interior felt a little bit simple, but once I got up on the road, I would say that I understand the appeal of this car, because I think the highlight of it is the way it handles and the way it drives, and I think it actually drives better than the Atto 3 SUV. So if you're considering between these two, obviously if you want more practicality, then the BYD Atto 3 is probably a good option, but if you are concerned about driving dynamics and you want a car that performs and handles well, I would say the MG4 is probably the better car to look at. And if you're interested to check out the BYD Atto 3, I will be reviewing the car very shortly, and I'll leave the video link up here once it's ready, so you can take a look at that as well and you can see and make the considerations there. Other than that, I would say that in conclusion, this MG4 will work very well for people who are looking to get started in the EV segment, try out their first EV car, and also for consumers who are a little bit more concerned about driver dynamics. I think this is a good car to start with. If not, I will leave you at that. But before we go, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you have found this review useful in any particular way. If you have any other questions about the car as well, please put them in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them. And if not, as usual, please take care of yourself, stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.